So good evening. To start, I would just like to thank you all for being here. Very much appreciate seeing you, even if it's just your name. And as Sokuzan has been doing, just letting you know that while we're not doing a formal fundraiser this year, as we gear up for our big capital campaign next year, trying to build this Buddha Hall, if you have any end of year giving that you are looking to make, we hope that you will consider us. We will certainly put that to good use to make sure that we are able to continue to offer these teachings freely and widely as much as possible, as well as to continue our outreach into the community. So thank you for all of your support, your generosity, and your participation. This evening, I'm going to be talking about the idea of a spiritual friend. And there's two ways in which I would like to talk about this, but I wanted to start with a verse from a compilation of the Pali Canon that Bhikkhu Bodhi put together. I've talked about this a little bit in a few other talks. It's the Buddha's teachings on social and communal harmony. And this comes from the Samyutta Nikaya. It's just two short lines, paragraphs. The Venerable Ananda approached the Blessed One, paid homage to him, sat down to one side and said, Bhante, this is half of the spiritual life. That is good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship. Not so, Ananda, not so, Ananda. This is the entire spiritual life, Ananda. That is good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship. And that struck me that as perhaps some of you heard, I talked about the idea of right speech or complete speech and the Buddha's incredible emphasis on communication, similar to Sokuzan. And here Ananda says that half of the spiritual life is good friendship, the spiritual friend. And the Buddha says, not so, that is the entire spiritual life, the entire spiritual path. And the first part of that, the first area I wanted to talk about is the word Sokuzan uses, the traditional Kalyanamitra, the spiritual friend or friend in the virtue, and in a sense is often our first spiritual friend. And so I wanted to break that down. What does that mean? A spiritual friend, how is that different from a traditional friend? And there's something about friendship where we really wish for the well-being of one another. We want each other to feel well and to succeed. But when we add that spiritual dimension to it, there's an inspiration to help somebody see beyond the trappings of their own mind, the trappings of their own conditioning. And so the spiritual friend's intention, the Kalyanamitra, the teacher, the guru, the sensei, the shifu, whatever word you'd like to use, has some insight into something deeper that we may not be aware of yet. And then the entire relationship is oriented towards the student beginning to see this. And it's not an easy relationship to enter into, and it's not a relationship to be entered into casually, but the necessity for most of us seems to come from our unwillingness or simply our inability to look beyond our limited sight, our limited experience, our limited preconceptions and ideas. Somebody that can challenge us in such a way that doesn't shut us down further, but actually begins to inspire us to look deeper. And that relationship changes over time. And I think it was Trungpa Rinpoche that talked about somewhat of a successive experience with the teacher, that it may start off initially as somewhat parental, that it's a mother, it's a father, it's a refuge of safety, it's a refuge of comfort, while at the same time encouraging one to begin to take off the training wheels. And then Trungpa Rinpoche says it goes on, and then it starts to develop as a friendship where you have some degree of intelligence and the teacher doesn't interfere with that particularly, but they're still there. And he culminates it with this idea of a Vajra master, which is without any sort of confines. You can't particularly define that it may show up where the teacher is completely present in a traditional sense, as Sokuzan talks about Kobenshino Roshi, or completely and immediately and totally present in your business moment by moment. But that spiritual friendship, I feel, begins to evolve to include the sangha. That would be the other aspect of this friendship. And Sokuzan has said that the teacher is, or the sangha is the teacher in many parts. And that really struck me because that is a heavy statement. It's a pretty strong statement to make, that when we look at one another, the teacher is saying that this is not other than the teacher. It's a teacher broken up. It's an opportunity for us to look at that same spiritual quality, to look at the mind, to look at our limited perceptions, to have somebody challenge us in such a way where we can't just maintain a sense of equanimity, peacefulness, but we begin to look deeper. And when the Buddha says the entirety of the spiritual path is good friendship, it really seems to wrap it up with that idea of the bodhisattva vow. That if our practice becomes dissociated or disconnected from the very people that are around us, the very situations that are around us, it could be difficult to consider that the spiritual path, because it becomes so isolated. It's just another relative situation that we've created opposing everything else. And so those boundaries through this relationship to the teacher, these boundaries through the relationship to the sangha, begin to break down, where the entirety of our practice is always present. It's always available. It's whatever is presenting itself to us moment by moment. And as always, this development of friendship, this development of relationship seems to be rooted in our practice of meditation. And I imagine that many of us have seen that as we practice these teachings, as they're presented to us. In some ways, the relationship to the teacher changes, in that we begin to see the way in which we laminate our opinions onto the teacher. We laminate our expectations onto the teacher. And the intimacy or the vulnerability begins to increase as we lose the reference point of really understanding what the nature of that relationship is. That when you begin to see the teacher, you really can't know what you're looking at. But to also consider that the same situation is happening when we look at one another, that we really cannot fundamentally see what any one person is working with. So we lose those barriers, we lose those distinctions, or they begin to become weak or permeable. And the practice of meditation helps us relate to that in a way where we don't immediately solidify what begins to soften. We don't immediately turn it into another concept or a strategy or a system of working with it. We actually have a willingness to be with that vulnerability. And it is in this way that the teaching and the relationship to the teacher becomes quite threatening. It can be, and that's not everyone's experience. That may not be necessary for everybody. But when we no longer can evaluate the teachings that we're receiving in a conventional sense, we actually have to look at whatever is arising and recognize that all we can do is receive it. Just like the aspects of the mind that arise in meditation, we can't categorize it for long. We just have to work on receiving it without any labels, without any expectation, without any reference point. And so just coming back to the original lines from the Samyutta Nikaya, to consider that, how our practice, this practice we have to do by ourselves, the practice we do as we sit down and train our mind, is not other than relating to the world, is not other than relating to the teacher, is not other than relating to the sangha. If there are any questions about that relationship, I would be happy to respond to those. And I do want to say before that happens is I've been very lucky to relate on a daily basis to Sokuzan for going on 12 years now. And I've been very lucky to be a part of this sangha for a very long time, particularly in this digital format. And as this monastic community arises, And I feel that these two areas are ones we should really endeavor to spend some time with, because it's so easy to misunderstand, because these are not conventional relationships. And so long as we grasp onto a conventional understanding of a relationship, sangha can fall apart, student-teacher relationships can fall apart because of the demand we place based on how we think we should relate to a boss, a coworker, a partner. And so I would really encourage you, if you have questions about relating to the student-teacher relationship or the sangha relationship, that please don't hesitate to ask those. And I, again, will do my best to respond.
Isaac bowing.
Go ahead, Isaac.
How can I relate to the teacher more genuinely? Is that a word? Yeah, genuinely. Bowing.
I believe, and I hate to put this out publicly, but I feel like you're endeavoring to move here at some point. That's really valuable. It's a lot harder to maintain any sense of artificiality when you get into a situation where you're constantly involved and present. And so that's a big part of it. I know you have Dokusan regularly and you participate regularly. And I would say just be as sincere with your questions as you can. I don't know what your Dokusans are like, but when that situation comes up, be willing to be a fool, be willing to embarrass yourself in front of the teacher so that you present that opportunity to learn. And I also feel that any one of us, myself included, can work on being concise. That there are ways to ask, boil down what we have to ask and be very direct about it, and ask another question about it, and ask another question about it. And I talked a little bit about this during Denkoe session, is that when I look at my questions, I first look at what is the assumption I'm making in order to ask this question. So if I want to ask about anger, but I first assume we all know what anger is, and I don't ask what is anger, it doesn't give the teacher that opportunity. So seeing if there's any assumptions you make before you ask the question that you could clarify first seems like a good way to really go down into it with the teacher.
Isaac bowing. The idea of not hesitating is magnetizing to me. Um, is that a helpful practice to be more genuine bowing?
If it's coming up, I would look at it. I wouldn't necessarily try to implement it, though. The reason is not hesitating, it holds so much assumption about how that would look. And hesitating could also have or not hesitating could still have a tremendous amount of space. So if it's showing up for you, I would look at that. I would reflect on that, and just don't try to live up to that too much. Whatever shows up in the moment, you don't really need to premeditate Dokusan too much. A little bit, you may have a list of questions you want to ask, but it's just like the way Sokuzan trains us to give talks. I had these few lines from the sutra tonight, but that was it. So similarly, I may have a rough idea of what I want to ask Sokuzan and Dokusan, but as soon as he responds, I endeavor to ask my next question out of what he's responded. Instead of like a checklist, you have this is how Dokusan goes sometimes. Question 1, okay, thank you. Question 2, okay, thank you. Question 3, okay, thank you. And it may be that you never leave question 1 because you hear the response and you want to know more. You really take time with that before you go on to the next question. So not premeditating too much.
I was wondering if you'd read those lines again.
The Venerable Ananda approached the Blessed One, paid homage to him, sat down to one side and said, Bhante, this is half of the spiritual life. That is good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship. Not so, Ananda, not so, Ananda. This is the entire spiritual life, Ananda. That is good friendship, good companionship, and good comradeship.
Oh, divine, is that saying that relationship is the spiritual life? Bowing?
As a path quality, it is something that I feel we need to look at very closely, because if we look at that bodhisattva vow, that aspiration to liberate all beings, to be with all things, to alleviate suffering of others, the first thing we have to do is look at the preconception. And I thought this was really interesting in reading this text. The Buddha talks about 4 people. One that does not work for the benefit of self or other, one that works for the benefit of other and not for self, one that works for the benefit of self and not for other, and one that works for the benefit of both. And what's curious, at least in here, the Buddha says that the one who works for the benefit of self and not for the benefit of others actually is considered more advanced than one that works for the benefit of others and not for oneself. That's not to be misunderstood as a selfish practice, but to recognize, because of how heavily we laminate our prejudice onto the world, if we do not take the time to train one's own mind, we oftentimes end up causing more pain and difficulty. And then he goes on to say that the one who works for the benefit of oneself and other is to be held in the highest regard. So it's interesting that really the distinction between the Theravada and the Mahayanas is really just an emphasis on aspects of the Buddhist teachings, because he was talking about this in the original Pali text, is that work for the benefit of others, endeavor to alleviate the suffering of others. So I think that if we consider our vow to be with all things, that anything we do in the realm of spirituality or spiritual practice relating to the teacher, relating to our practice, the chanting, the studying, if in some sense it is not with the aspiration or the intention, maybe that's the good word, intention, to not just alleviate one's own suffering, but to be of benefit to the world, it may have value, but it may not quite be what we're endeavoring with that bodhisattva vow. So I do feel that relationship is incredibly important to our practice.
What about, and you're saying relationship to self and relationship to other?
That's how the path starts out, yes. That we first start by training one's own mind. But we don't have to, I think it's interesting that never is at the expense of others. That doesn't have to be a mutually exclusive situation where you just have to work on self. I think that inevitably training one's own mind naturally begins to express itself in the world, and it's not something we have to do artificially. So having that strong foundation of sitting meditation, I feel naturally informs the rest of our activity.
For you in bowing, how does a demand or a grasping and a demand in, let's say, like the teacher-student relationship or in the sangha promote a falling apart or a breakdown?
The idea of maintaining anything, it's this idea that something can be held on to indefinitely, or that the reason we should do it is because it's valid, instead of cooperating and working with the situation. So there's very definite examples of this, and one of our sister temples had this very thing happen where the sangha split into 2 factions and the entire thing fell apart. They had to excuse all of the practice residents and restart. Everyone was asked to leave. And it was because of this fixation that prevented any form of communication. And without the communication, any interactions, cooperation, collaboration were not possible, not in any meaningful way. So it's not compromising, it's seeing that the situation is more important than any ideas that we can maintain, any logic that we can impute. And that's just the worst feeling to ego. It's the worst feeling to an identity, to have to concede, or what appears to be conceding, to a situation when you know in your heart you're correct, you're completely validated in what you think and what you're doing. to actually look at what is it that I can do to be of benefit to the situation.
Yun bowing, how does a sense of openness promote like a togetherness?
I don't know what a sense of openness is too much. The closest I come is to just not knowing what I'm doing. And it's in that curiosity that you can consider. There's another C. There's so many C words. You can consider what's arising in front of you. It fosters cooperation because you don't know what to do next. And you talk about it and you're actually curious about what others are saying. That's something that's so wonderful when the sangha comes together and interacts, is that we do have differing ideas. And if we can actually hear somebody who we don't agree with and really try to consider what they're asking or what they're saying, even in the midst of our knee-jerk opposition to it, that opportunity is rarely presented, because so often we form communities of consensus where unless you think like us, speak like us, that you're not going to work out here. And I think, especially, at least intellectually, there are so many ways in which this sangha approaches the Dharma that's really enriching. Yin Long.
Is spiritual friendship unconditional?
Spiritual friendship is an aspiration, and therefore it's not something that can be maintained. I think the relationship of a bodhisattva to the world is unconditional, meaning that they're not functioning out of conditions or confined by conditions. They may be functioning out of the conditions of warm, cold, up, down, day and night, but I don't think that they're corralling their activities of body, speech, and mind out of some sort of prescribed activity. So I think spiritual friendship is an aspiration, and I think it has an aspiration of unconditionality, that so long as we're endeavoring to see this together, you endeavor to give each other the benefit of the doubt, or I say endeavor to give others the benefit of the doubt, and you endeavor to give others the benefit of the doubt, because we cannot know the way in which they need to traverse this path. And I feel that it also requires a tremendous amount of respect for the teacher and how they relate to each student. Because I know for me, there are things I get irritated by, or I wish I had that, instead of seeing if I'm getting it, then that's what I need. No more, no less. And that's, again, very distasteful. Nobody wants that. And at the same time, it's hard to find somebody who can give you precisely that.
You just used the word respect, and that's something that I've struggled with for years, because it seems like I know what it is until I look at it, and then it doesn't make sense. So can you say anything about what respect means to you?
It's a bit helpless, because the type of respect is not earned. It's not a transactional respect. It's like you could look at every single person in this room and probably tell me something that's irritating to you about them, including myself, and probably including your teacher. And the type of respect we're talking about is to not meddle with that, because you do not know what that means to their path. And for you to prematurely take that away, or to foist something upon somebody, is not something we can see. So it's a type of respect that's not about maintaining standards of ethics or chivalry or manners. It's a type of respect that appreciates that we cannot see the causes and conditions that preceded any given situation. So again, to ego, it's unpleasant. It's how could you do that? You're telling me you couldn't see that kind of attitude, and that still arises. But doing our best not to engage it, not to outflow out of that negativity, or if we need to outflow out of it, being very considerate to try to look at it, not validate it. Jishin.
Jishin bowing. Where do you find the answer to the question, what can be a benefit to the situation? Bowing.
As long as you don't leave the question, you're probably in the best position to relate to the situation. As soon as you prescribe something, as soon as you answer that question, again, you begin to solidify something that cannot be maintained. And so to just have that intention, how can I be of benefit? And it never needs a response, or maybe using the word Sokuzan emphasizes, what is it to benefit? What is beneficial? As long as we're asking a question, there's a little bit of, you could say, space before we respond. There's a little bit of space before we react. And so I would say, if you can, don't necessarily find an answer to that. Or if you do, have a soft enough touch where that answer can change. Sanho.
What is the sense of burdening Sangha by being irritating?
What is the sense of burdening Sangha by being irritating? I don't know if I can say this. Maybe Sokuzan needs to say this. It's narcissism. It's ego. We all do it. We all do it. Oh, I don't want to bother anybody. I can't come around. I'm in too bad a mood. I don't want to disrupt. There's all sorts of stories around that, which again, it puts us above others, because we're saying others aren't ready to receive what's coming out of me. Others are not ready. We are making a decision of somebody else's ability. So I would say, of course, there are aspects of our personalities that may soften with time, or we may get some feedback that is helpful. But I think the most important thing is to continue to put ourselves in the position to relate to one another. And I also know there are times where we do have to remove ourselves, but they are probably less often than we think. Is there more to that?
Yes, but not right now. Something wrong.
Okay. Further questions this evening? Yoka.
Yoka bowing. Is there an open way to relate to Sangha? Especially in the aspect of teaching, the Sangha teacher, Sangha as a teacher relationship?
The way I've related to it over the years is so simple and straightforward, and it's just a matter of continuing to show up. Again, it's not necessarily figuring out how to do it. We actually begin to see what we need to do by just continuing to return. And so I just think there's a tremendous amount of power in just showing up for the Sangha in no other way than just relating to the forms, coming in and practicing, being kind. How are you? Do you need anything today? So keep it very simple, but just continue to do what you do, which is return and show up.
Milkaban. So is returning to the forms, is this a teaching?
Of course, it's a teaching. It's just not something that we may be able to tie down or pin down what the teaching is. The example I use is after having chanted morning service 7 days a week for a decade, I could not have told you after 2 years or 5 years, or even now, I can't tell you why that was a teaching, but there's something about that was incredibly powerful, incredibly direct, and at the same time, very ambiguous. So there is something about returning that is a teaching, but again, I feel it's nice that you don't have to know what the teaching is. In a sense, you start to enjoy yourself. Further question, I feel, and I don't mean to antagonize anybody, I feel like that this is an incredibly rich area, and of all my time here, relating to the teacher and relating to the Sangha are two of the areas that have just been so incredibly important. Sanho.
Sanho bowing. Is it not spiritual to not be able to relate to others, maybe because of harmful behavior or something?
No, we really can't distinguish spiritual and not spiritual. And of course, when I say that, that was like the first thing I did, right? It was the beginning of my talk. But once we step onto the path, everything we relate to, we endeavor to receive. So you may know that, but I would also say that that's an area where we take advantage of, or we relate to or utilize that relationship to the teacher to express those areas and see if there's ways in which we can work with them. Because if we shut down entirely, it's like the situation becomes stagnant. We just say that's so distasteful that can never get out, and so we don't even look at it. So utilizing the forms to have a container to relate to those in a way that is supportive without going in either direction that's too extreme of never ever doing it or just doing whatever we want around it.
Beyond bowing, how is it that the relationship with the teacher, the spiritual friend, can change so drastically over time and still persist?
That's a really good question, and that shows up so uniquely for each one of us. Sometimes it's as our receptivity, as we start to open up to the teacher, we actually begin to expose ourselves to the teacher. The teacher, I don't think this is the best way of saying, but they utilize it, they take advantage of that, so they see an opening and they move into that. It also may be that it's just not time for it to be soft anymore, or it's time for it to be soft. So it can take any form, and as a student, it's not so much for us to understand why, but is it something that we are willing to receive, we are willing to relate to as part of the path, instead of relying on that traditional discrimination of right and wrong, appropriate, inappropriate. When we do that, we also should not abandon our own intelligence. I should say that as well. And the way in which we do that is by being willing to and having an opportunity to ask questions when we don't understand a teaching, and to do so in such a way where we try to express that with as much room to receive a response. We've all posed questions that are more about antagonizing or accusations. It's a backhanded way of actually making a comment or a jab, instead of having the openness. I don't understand that. Please, can you help me understand that? Or I had an incredible reaction to that, and is there a way that I can relate to that without it becoming an outflow? So the way in which we ask questions, and in a sense, where we ask questions from, really modifies how the teachings show up.
Beyond bowing, what are some of those places you see that we ask questions from?
I can say where I ask questions from, when I'm incredibly inflamed and looking to make a point, when I am frightened and don't know what to do, and I'm looking more for someone to just tell me it's okay. Sometimes there's genuine curiosity. Sometimes it's purely intellectual. Like how does the seventh consciousness appropriate with vasanas, or the four types of kleshas of the seventh consciousness: pride of self, love of self, self-delusion. How do those function? So intellectual. And I notice that, especially if I see I'm in a really inflamed area, if I can really try to look at what I want to know, that question Sokuzan poses to us a lot, and distill down through the emotion, what is the main thing I don't understand that I could ask about? And that takes time sometimes. It may take a day, it may take a week, it may take longer. But we should endeavor to persist so that we ask that question. And if we don't understand the response the first time, we should ask it again. And if we understand the response the first time, we should still probably ask it again. Because you notice too that the responses change. Michelle
Bowing. I'm going to formulate this on the fly, but my question is around the spiritual friend relationship that we might have with people in the sangha, and that kind of blurred line between a casual friendship with the same people?
Question mark.
Question mark. It seems very fuzzy to me how to relate to somebody in Sangha as a casual friend or as a spiritual friend. Is there a difference between the two, and what might be the difference between the two?
I don't think so. I think sometimes we enjoy each other and we joke around and we go for walks or play cornhole, and other times we're engaged in discussions around the Dharma. Sometimes we're having interviews. So all of that is part of the relationship. I don't know that we need to make the distinction of where it becomes casual and where it's spiritual, but if there's anything, we could come back to that intention. What is our intention? To support one another. And you can do that in all those areas, it seems. Other questions this evening? You.
Beyond value. How is it that the spiritual friend is also a stand-in for like a mother or father or brother?
Yeah.
Whatever relationship we're looking for.
Yeah, it's like there's an aspect of every relationship you've ever, or for me, there's an aspect of every relationship I've ever had in the teacher, and yet there's something in that relationship that has not particularly been present in any other relationship. So sometimes it's almost like friendship, and sometimes it is parental, and sometimes it is adversarial. What was your question?
How are they a stand-in in those, in a sense, those different relationships?
I don't know that they're a stand-in, and maybe that's in that I wouldn't take that away from you. So for me, it's not been so much of a stand-in, it's just that situationally that it always seems appropriate, and it would be weird. It would seem almost it would just doesn't seem like it would make sense if Sokuzan just maintained the same thing in all areas that he related to me, watching TV or talking. We were talking about music earlier today, or when I'm in Dokusan, that whatever shows up, whatever needs to show up can show up. And I think that that's really an incredible thing, that it's not a matter of maintaining continuity or consistency in the way we're treated or related to. So in that way, it can show up completely appropriately, where there are times where you're just comforted, you're just taken in such a way where I just need to be safe for a little bit for my own thoughts. And the teacher can do that, and then they can come right back around, and not physically, but point out your soft spot, hit you in that wound that Trungpa Rinpoche talks about. Sometimes it has surprised me where you can't expect anything. Sometimes you come into a situation looking for one thing, and if something else arises, if that's your teacher, you're still going to try to receive that. And this is it's a funny story now. It wasn't at the time, but a few days after my mom died, I was having a hard time. My mom was a very sweet woman, and I was talking to Sokuzan, and I said probably, and probably, say it, probably. So the teachings don't take a break. There's not a time when you can demand anything. So that was very difficult to think, I'm telling you about my mom just dying and you're correcting what I'm saying. I didn't say that. I said probably. I repeated it back. But as long as you're a student, endeavor to receive, no matter the situation or what the expectation is around that. My mom was fine. Any other questions this evening? Sanho.
Oh, no bowing. Do you have a sense of family with Sangha?
A sense of family with Sangha. I care so incredibly much about this community that I am willing to be the Shuso, Ino, and Sukansu all at once. yes, I care more than I could express for what this community is and the situation SokukoJi has helped bring together through his training and his inspiration. So yes, but just like family, you know, there's still tussles and not everyone's as close as those two people. Like I'm very close with my older brother and I love my younger brother a tremendous amount. And just a different relationship. And similarly here, it gets weird when you marry somebody in the sangha though, right? Dharma sister to a wife. SokukoJi.
Is there anyone in the sangha that dislikes you?
More than one, probably.
You like them?
I do.
What's that about?
Liking them or them not liking me.
However you interpret what I just asked.
I don't know what that's about, but it doesn't require any elaboration on my end to care about people that show up here. Thank you. Feel like that's a good place to close the talk for the night. So thank you all for coming. If you value these talks and would like them to continue, please visit our donate page at www.sokukoji.org. Thank you.